Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History Episodes. Tonight, we're not wandering through castles or chasing banners through distant stretches of sand. Instead, we step slowly into the silence after the wars, the part of history no one carved into stone. It is the part owned by one man, a name that still echoes across centuries: Genghis Khan. The world remembers him as a conqueror, but in the quiet, he built something far more terrifying, an empire that didn't just win wars, it bred them. Imagine the Mongol Empire at its peak, armies swallowing continents whole, cities burned to ash, entire bloodlines erased from existence. But when the swords were finally sheathed and the screaming faded into the wind, something colder began to take shape. Genghis Khan's empire turned the defeated into a resource. Women became ledgers. Children became strategy. A child, born not for peace but for war, his bloodline chosen, his purpose written before he could even speak. By 5, he would draw a bow. By 16, ride into battle. By 20, father children he would never know. This was not chance. It was design, an unbroken system built to manufacture soldiers generation after generation. If you're intrigued by this dark side of history, where human lives became instruments of war, feel free to like and subscribe. Only if you find yourself drawn to the hidden stories of survival and sacrifice. Curious about the brutal truths of empires that shaped our world. Share where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to know how these stories travel from one listener to another, across time and space. Now, dim the lights. Let the silence wrap gently around you. Outside, the world fades until only the wind remains. Breathe in, cold air, iron, damp earth, and the faint echo of hooves somewhere far away. Listen closer, and you can hear the rustle of coarse wool, the whisper of a forgotten tongue, the low hum of an empire breathing. On the Mongol plains, survival isn't earned, it's measured. Blood for blood, breath for breath, and mercy. Doesn't live here. You're there now. The wind cuts like a blade. The night smells of ash, and the ground beneath you is soft. Too soft. The battle has ended, but nothing around you feels like victory. The warriors are gone. Their shadows linger, and you are not a soldier. You are what's left. Footsteps approach, slow and deliberate. They find you, their eyes cold like the steppe itself. Your name doesn't matter. Your voice doesn't matter. In this world, fate is decided by the nod of a man you'll never meet. You are claimed, your future folded away like a torn page in someone else's story. Here, under Genghis Khan's sky, bodies become borders. Blood becomes strategy, and silence is the language of power. The wind whispers across the steppe. You stand, small, fragile, on the edge of a world you don't fully understand. The earth is dry, cracked, like an old leather hide stretched too thin. The grasses, tall and untamed, sway around you, brushing your legs. A feeling of vastness, of something immense, yet so delicate, hangs in the air. You are not alone. The horses are everywhere. They move in silent swarms, untamed, wild-eyed. Their heavy hooves pound against the ground, a steady, rhythmic beat. The scent of dust and sweat fills the air. You inhale it deep, and it lingers on your tongue. The world is vast, and you, so small, are here to become part of it. You cling to the reins, your fingers trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation, as if the very touch of them will tether you to this vast, unforgiving world. The leather feels foreign in your hands, rough, unfamiliar, its texture scraping against your palm like the earth scraping against the sky. It's as if the reins have lived more than you have, witnessing countless riders, countless trials, countless failures. The horse beneath you feels like a force of nature itself, It is more than just an animal. Its bones, its breath, its very presence speak to something primal, something ancient that runs deeper than survival. Every shift of its weight, every twitch of its muscles reminds you of the strength it holds, the power it commands. It does not wait for you to be ready. It is ready, and you are not ready. You feel your heart race, thump, 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 matching the rhythm of the hooves pounding against the earth beneath you. But your hands are unsteady. Your grip is weak. The reins slip, just for a second, and you feel the world tilt. For a brief moment, you're lost, tethered to nothing but fear and the uncertain, churning ground beneath you. But the horse doesn't care. It doesn't hesitate. It doesn't pause to give you time. It is its own beast, its own force. It understands the rhythm of life, the unyielding pace of survival. It knows the ways of the steppe, the winds, the earth, the endless horizon. You are a part of it, whether you are ready or not. The wind cuts through the air, harsh and biting. It feels like ice against your skin, sharp and unforgiving. But the horse, oh, the horse, its heat seeps into you, and you feel its power in every muscle, in every shift of its body. It feels like nothing you've ever known. The rhythm of the hooves, steady, constant, gives way to the rhythm of your heart. It beats fast in your chest. Thump, thump, thump. But you must match it. There's no time to hesitate, no time to falter. The child beside you, barely more than a whisper in the wind, rides with ease, a natural fluid motion that makes your attempts look awkward, uncoordinated. Their eyes are focused ahead. No time for hesitation, no room for weakness. They do not speak. They do not need to. Their eyes say it all. Their hands, gripping the reins with unwavering strength, guide the horse without a single word. Their body moves in perfect harmony with the beast beneath them. This is how it is done. This is the way of the steppe. You stumble. Your legs falter, weak and untrained. But the horse, silent, patient, does not slow. It carries you, whether you are ready or not, and you feel it, the weight of survival. The earth beneath you becomes uneven, silt, stones, damp patches of ground. You hear the subtle scrape of hooves against dirt, the soft thud of hooves on soft earth. But the ride never slows. It is relentless. It is everything. The world is vast, and you are small. But you must learn. You must adapt. There is no room for fear here. Only motion. Endless motion. The wind in your face. The galloping beat of hooves. The tug of reins in your hands. The sting of the air as it cuts across your skin. The pressure in your chest as your heart races. But this is not just about riding a horse. No, your role here is much darker, far more insidious. Your body, your bloodline, is being molded for a purpose that will forever erase your identity. You are not merely learning to survive the steppe. You are being shaped into a tool of conquest. The Mongol Empire, in its relentless quest for domination, did not stop at training warriors. That was only the beginning. The empire understood that in order to maintain its strength and power, it needed more than just skilled fighters. It needed a new breed of soldiers. Not just men who could wield a sword, but warriors who were forged from their very bloodlines, their bodies, their minds, carefully crafted to serve a single, ruthless purpose: to conquer. These warriors weren't just born, they were made. The Mongol rulers recognized that true strength didn't come from just physical ability, but from the very genetics that ran through their veins. And so, a new, dark strategy emerged, one that would see bloodlines carefully selected and shaped, molding the very future of the empire. A program, brutal in its nature, designed not only to create warriors, but to breed them, to build an army from the strongest, most capable men and women, and pass that strength down through the generations. This breeding program was not about love or even mutual desire. It was about the cold, hard reality of survival in the brutal world of conquest. Forced marriages, selected not for compatibility, but for physical prowess, for strength, for resilience, were the foundation of this empire's future. Women, like you, were chosen not for their hearts, but for the strength of their bodies, their bloodlines, their ability to produce the next generation of soldiers. Your life, your body, became the vessel for the creation of warriors, warriors who would be stronger, faster, more ruthless than any before. You, forced into marriages with men chosen for their strength, were viewed as vessels, tools to produce the warriors of tomorrow. Your fate was sealed the moment your bloodline was marked for the empire's purpose. You were to give birth to the next generation of conquerors, stronger, faster, and more ruthless than any before. There was no love here, only bloodlines. Only the selection of the strongest, the fittest, the most capable of producing warriors who would fight without hesitation, without mercy. Your children would be shaped from the moment they were conceived, trained before they could walk, taught to kill before they could understand what it meant to live. And the lesson, the harshest of all, was that you had no voice here. Your survival, your purpose, was no longer your own. It belonged to the empire. You were part of a system that created warriors, not from strength of spirit, but from blood. Your bloodline would decide whether your children lived to fight, or were culled before they could even lift a weapon. The earth beneath you shifts, and you realize that you are no longer just a woman of the steppe. You are part of something larger, a system that has already decided your fate. And there is no escape. You will survive, or you will be forgotten. And that, in the world you now inhabit, is the only choice you have. The wind whispers through the empty plains, its voice soft, almost mocking. You stand, once a woman of your own will, now a tool, a vessel. The world around you is wide, but the walls you now face are unseen, tightening around your body, your life, your very essence. You are no longer the woman you once were, no longer an individual. You are now part of a system, a machine built for war. The Mongol Empire, in its unrelenting drive for conquest, did not simply focus on the battlefield. It sought to control everything. It took what it wanted, and that included women. Women were not seen as people to love, to cherish, but as instruments to create the next generation of warriors. Your body, once your own, was now claimed by the empire, to be molded, used, and discarded when no longer of service. It started with the raids. The villages were swept through, everything taken, everything controlled. Your life, like many others, was no longer in your hands. You were chosen, marked, taken from your home, your family, and forced into a life you had never asked for. Your face was never seen by the ones who chose you. Only your physical potential was considered. You were taken for your strength, your youth, and your ability to bear children. Children who would one day fight, kill, and die for the empire. Forced marriages became the norm. No love, no choice, only the brutal demand for survival and reproduction. You were paired with men who were not of your choosing. Men whose faces you would never come to know. Their eyes cold, indifferent, like animals who had no care for what lay beneath your skin. They were towering, massive, their strength more than triple your own, their bodies hard as stone, as if sculpted for nothing but battle. You had no say in the matter. Your body was claimed, not in love, but in force. It was no longer your own. It was a tool, an instrument for creating the next generation of warriors, and that was all. A vessel, empty, but for the empire's purpose. You would feel their hands on you, rough and violent, gripping, shoving you into places you never thought your body could go. The hands that touched you were rough, violently grabbing, forcing your body into positions you couldn't have imagined. The pressure was unrelenting, as if your body was no longer yours. It was just flesh for them to manipulate, to use, to break down for their purpose. You were nothing but flesh to them, a body to be used, a tool to serve the greater need. Every thrust felt like a violation, a tearing of what was once yours. Your body racked with pain, pain you couldn't scream through, pain you couldn't escape. Each time, it felt as if something was being torn away from you, a part of you breaking off that would never heal, each thrust deep and merciless, leaving you in a constant state of pain. Pain that you couldn't scream through. No sound could escape your throat. It was too raw. There was no escape, no relief. How long did it last? It was never just a moment, not just a few minutes. No, it stretched on, longer than you could bear, 2 or 3 hours at a time, sometimes more. You never knew how much longer they would take. The hours felt like endless waves, crashing into you with no hope of stopping. And it wasn't just one man. Not always. Sometimes there would be 2, sometimes 3. They came and went, each one taking their turn. They didn't care that your body was fragile, that you were worn out, that you bled, that you cried. Each one took what he needed and then left, leaving you exhausted, broken, too tired to even think about the next time. There was no tenderness here, no care, only roughness, cruel hands that never stopped, that didn't care if you were clean or not. There was no hygiene, no mercy. Their bodies were filthy, sweat, dirt, and the sharp stench of men who had been on the move for far too long, their breath hot and sour against your skin. They didn't care if you were hurting, if you were too sore to stand, too tired to move. You were simply a tool, a necessary part of a cycle, a body to be used again and again until there was nothing left of you. It wasn't just the pain you felt in those moments. It was the humiliation, the knowledge that you were nothing more than a vessel, a place where the Empire's needs were filled. And when it was done, they left, and you were left with the mess they'd created, sore, dirty, empty. It felt like your very being was chipped away with every encounter, but there was no room for complaint, no room for tears, no room for escape. You had no choice, and neither did your body. It had become nothing but a tool, shaped, used, and discarded. Your body, fragile and small, was crushed beneath the weight of their brutality, a weight you were never prepared for. Their strength was overpowering, their dominance undeniable. They were built for war, built for violence, while you were made to endure it. Each movement they made was calculated, powerful, like a machine in motion, while you twisted beneath them, a mere shell of your former self, straining to keep up with a pace that threatened to break you. Every inch of you felt it, the pressure, the force, the grinding friction of your body beneath theirs. Your skin screamed, your muscles burned with each painful thrust, each bruise, each wound, adding to the growing list of injuries that would never truly heal. But you were not allowed to rest. There was no respite, only the continued strain of their force on your fragile frame. The life of a woman in this world was harsh, unforgiving. Each day felt like a repetition of the last, with no hope of escape. The fear of the unknown was constant. You didn't know what your next life would bring. Another child, another man, another battle. But it wasn't just the physical toll. It was the psychological weight that crushed you day after day until you no longer recognized yourself. The pain didn't end when their hands left your body. It lingered, settling deep in your chest, clinging to your thoughts, reminding you that you were no longer a person. You were nothing, nothing more than a tool, a vessel for the Empire's needs. Each day the weight grew heavier, draining you of your identity, leaving you hollow. You were made to feel small, insignificant, as though your entire existence was only to serve the war machine. Every moment, you were reminded of how little your body mattered, how meaningless your desires were. There was no room for you, no space to be human. You were reduced to your biological function, a tool in a world that cared only about war, about the relentless march of conquest, about creating more soldiers to fuel that march. In the quiet moments, when you were left alone, the emptiness was suffocating. You would think about the life you once had, before the empire claimed you, before you became a tool. But those thoughts were fleeting, fading quickly into the knowledge that your life was now bound to the empire's will. You had no voice, no choice, only the ache of your body as it was used to fulfill the empire's mission. You would bear your children, knowing that they too would one day be forced into this cycle, trained to kill, to fight, to conquer. And so the cycle continued, generation after generation of women and men, forced into roles they never asked for, shaped for war, born for war. There was no escaping it, not for you, not for your children. This was the life you were now part of, and the price of survival was steep. In the end, you were not seen as a woman, but as a cog in the machinery of the Mongol Empire, a machine that would crush anything that stood in its way. And as you lay in the cold, feeling the weight of your new life, you couldn't help but wonder, what did it mean to be human when every part of you had been taken and molded into something else? From the moment they were born, they were shaped for war. The children of the Mongol Empire, not just born, but made to fight, made to kill. Their lives were not their own. They were created for one singular purpose, to serve the Empire's endless hunger for conquest. As infants, they were strapped to horses. No cradles of warmth or comfort, no soft blankets or lullabies. Instead, they were bound to creatures far larger than themselves, the massive, untamed beasts that ruled the steppe. Their small, fragile bodies barely able to hold on, they clung desperately to reins that felt like iron chains. The wind cut through them, cold and relentless, as their tiny hands gripped the leather, not with innocence, but with a deep, primal instinct to survive. Before they could even form words, they learned the horse's rhythm, the sway of each stride, and the muscle ripples beneath their tiny bodies. The pounding of hooves became their heartbeat, each step a reminder that survival depended on this dance between rider and horse. Their tiny fingers trembled, grasping the reins not from affection, but from pure survival instinct. The horses were not kind, wild, untamable, and indifferent to the children who clung to them. If they fell, there would be no mercy. The steppe was cruel, vast and empty, a place where the weak didn't survive. There was no one to pick them up, no one to soothe their pain or lift them to their feet. If they fell, they were left behind, to be trampled by the very horses they once rode, or worse, forgotten in the harsh, unforgiving winds. By the age of 5, they were shooting arrows, not in play or as a game, but in practice, every shot serious, a test of skill and precision. Their tiny bodies balanced on horseback, legs stiff with effort, eyes locked on the target ahead. There was no time for hesitation and no room for mistakes. Each arrow fired was a lesson in survival, in the unforgiving world shaping them. From horseback, they aimed with deadly intent, small hands drawing the bowstring with surprising strength. The motion was smooth and fluid, but it had to be fast. Horses galloped beneath them, wind whipped their faces, and hearts pounded in rhythm with the ride. Each shot had to be timed perfectly, released in the split second when aim and motion aligned. There was no pause, no second chance. The shot had to be true. With precision, they learned the art of killing, not from malice, but as the necessary craft of war. Arrows did not merely fly, they carried the weight of survival, and each miss had consequences. There was no forgiveness for failure. Punishment was swift, and the lesson stark. Miss and you fail, and you're discarded with the weak. The Empire could not afford failure. No room for weakness, no room for fear, only the unyielding demand to survive. The sting of a missed target was nothing compared to the pain of not being strong enough to endure. They learned quickly they were not just training to shoot, but to become instruments of war, tools carrying the Empire's will. Every movement and every shot furthered their transformation into something cold, efficient, unstoppable. The Empire did not care about innocence, childhood, or dreams. It cared only for skill, sharpness, and speed to kill. By 5, they were already shaping their destiny, learning not to miss, not to fail, because failure erased them from the future. It was simple: survive or be forgotten. Their training was relentless. Each day their small bodies endured the harshest conditions: the steppes' cold wind, the biting frost, long hours without food or water. They drank from their horses and ate whatever they could find, young bodies stretched to their limits. Yet the Empire's demands never stopped. They weren't only learning to fight, they were learning to feel nothing. Joy, fear, and pain were stripped away by the brutality of training. They were remade like the machines of war, cold, calculating, unfeeling. Their childhood was stolen, smiles and laughter replaced by the silent, grim focus of a soldier. As they grew older, they were separated into groups. The Empire prized specialization, turning each child into a perfect tool for war: cavalrymen, archers, scouts, and commanders. Each unit was forged for a purpose: bodies, minds, and instincts honed to fit the role. They were no longer children. They were warriors, assigned to a future of blood and conquest. Cavalrymen learned to ride like the wind, to move as one with their horses, to strike swiftly and overwhelmingly. They trained to charge, to trample, to conquer by sheer force. Lives measured in gallops that crushed enemies under tides of hooves. Archers, with eyes sharp and precise, were honed to fire with deadly accuracy. They did not just shoot, they killed, each arrow a calculated strike, piercing hearts with mechanical precision. Their hands learned the bow like a limb, firing while riding, while sprinting, while the world devolved into chaos. Every shot was a command, a silent death delivered from a distance. They were taught to fight without hesitation and to kill without regret. There was no time for guilt, no space for second thoughts. Survival depended on obedience, on moving with the same cold efficiency as those who came before. There was no room for fear and no place for weakness. Mongol training was not only physical, it was mental. From their first steps, children were molded, shaped, and hardened. It wasn't enough to be strong, quick, or skilled. They had to be ruthless, cold, calculating. They were taught to think like predators, each battle a hunt, every enemy prey. They were trained not merely to obey, but to think ahead, to anticipate moves before enemies made them. They learned to see weakness in foes even before it became visible. Their minds were drilled to assess constantly, search for openings, and wait for the perfect moment to strike. They learned to read the battlefield like a map, to find patterns in chaos. Every movement was strategic, every decision calculated, no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. Warriors did not merely react, they planned, observed, and learned. They thought 3 steps ahead, stayed always prepared, and never allowed surprise. Their minds were honed like knives, sharp, precise, always seeking and exploiting weakness. Beyond tactics, conditioning meant survival. being ready for the worst and letting nothing catch them unprepared. They read the environment, listened to the night's silence, and felt tension in the air. They trusted instincts, sensing danger early, knowing when to attack and when to retreat. Their minds were as sharp as their weapons, and just as deadly. They detached from war's chaos, seeing it as natural, controllable, manipulable. Emotions had no place here. Fear had no place here. Only cold, calculated action. Their bodies too were honed, strong as their horses, able to endure brutal conditions. Endurance was both body and mind, inseparable in Mongol training. Survival rested not only on strength, but on the mental fortitude to keep moving and fighting no matter the odds. They were more than soldiers, true instruments of war, shaped by body and mind to be unstoppable, ruthless, relentless. By adulthood, they were perfect soldiers, trained from birth to fight, to kill, to conquer. Every breath and heartbeat reflected the brutality they had endured. They were no longer children in any true sense. Innocence had been erased by the Empire's demands. Emotions were stripped away like flesh from bone, leaving only the cold, calculated edge of a warrior. There was no room for softness and no space for doubt. Feelings were weakness, vulnerability the Empire could not afford. Their souls hardened by relentless training, tempered in war's unforgiving fire. Every lesson and scar further forged them into instruments of destruction. The cruelty they endured was not just physical, but psychological. A grinding process that removed everything they once were. They became layered, indifference over brutality, until feeling itself was buried too deep to reach. What was once raw and fragile, a soul brimming with innocence, was armored in survival, worn as a shield against the world. They had been children once, with dreams and desires, but those dreams were crushed by war's endless demands. Hearts once soft and pliable turned cold and unyielding, like the weapons they wielded. The Empire had no use for dreams. It needed soldiers, tools, weapons. The individuals they had been were lost. Families and friends faded into distant shadows of a vanished life. The Empire did not care for these memories or the humanity that had once been there. What mattered was survival and the production of soldiers who would fight, kill, and conquer without hesitation or remorse. In the end, they were more than soldiers. They were Mongol warriors, no longer human as the world understood it. Born to fight, trained to survive, destined to conquer. There was no room for love, no space for tenderness, no time for what might have been. They were tools, molded for one purpose only, to serve the Empire's endless war machine. This was the Mongol way, and this is how they built an empire that could not be stopped. The Empire had built them, perfect soldiers, tools of war with hearts of steel, minds sharpened like blades, trained to kill without hesitation, to conquer without remorse. But what happened when the battles were over? What was left of them when the war ended, when the blood was wiped from their hands, and the cries of battle faded into silence? The cost was high. The price paid by the warriors of the Mongol Empire was steep, and it wasn't just counted in the bodies that lay lifeless across the battlefield. It was measured in something far deeper. The souls that were lost in the heat of combat, the very essence of who they were, erased. With each battle fought, with every enemy vanquished, they sacrificed pieces of themselves. What remained after the bloodshed wasn't just their physical scars, but the quiet hollowness inside them, a void that grew with every victory, with every moment spent in the chaos of war. The battlefields were not just places of conquest. They were the crucible where they lost what made them human. There, amidst the screams, the blood, the endless cycle of violence, they learned to shut out their emotions, to bury everything they had once felt. There was no place for tenderness, no room for compassion. The battlefield demanded only one thing: the ability to kill, to conquer, to survive. And so, over time, their emotions were buried beneath the weight of this constant violence. They were forced to harden their hearts, to push away the things that made them feel, until love, grief, even joy, became foreign concepts. The psychological toll was devastating. Once the frenzy of battle subsided, once the noise of swords clashing and arrows flying grew silent, something far more insidious crept in: emptiness. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the absence of purpose, the absence of identity. In the midst of war, they had been something: a warrior, a conqueror, a force to be reckoned with. But now that the battle was over, now that the smoke cleared and the corpses lay still, they were left with nothing. There were no celebrations to mark their victory, no songs of triumph to sing, no spoils of war to savor. There was only a hollow silence, a silence that stretched endlessly, leaving them with the suffocating feeling of something lost, something irreplaceable, something they could never get back. They had been trained to fight, to kill, to conquer. But now, with no enemy left to destroy, the very foundation of their existence had crumbled. What happened to a soldier when there was no war to wage? Who were they if they were no longer warriors? What did they have to live for if their entire identity had been built on bloodshed and conquest? They had spent their lives being forged in the fire of war, their very essence molded by the brutal training, the endless battles, the sacrifice of everything they once were. And now that the fighting had stopped, what was left? The ability to feel was gone. The empire had trained it out of them. There was no room for empathy in the heart of a Mongol warrior. There was no space for sorrow, for regret, for anything that would make them question the violence they had inflicted. And so, when the war was over, when the battles had ended, they were left with nothing but the cold weight of their own existence. They couldn't turn off the soldier inside them. They couldn't shut off the instinct to fight, to kill, to dominate. But the battlefield had moved on, and they were left behind. In the quiet, the isolation crept in. The silence became unbearable because it reminded them of everything they had lost. They had sacrificed their humanity for the Empire's war machine, and in return, they received nothing. No peace, no rest, just a lifetime of emptiness. They could never return to the lives they once knew. They could never go back to being children, to feeling the simple joys of life. Their emotions were gone, replaced by the mechanical efficiency of the soldier. But the cost didn't just affect the warriors. It affected the entire society that had created them. The Mongol Empire, in its quest for domination, had shaped an entire generation of children to become weapons. And as those children grew, so too did the social consequences of creating such a brutal, emotionless army. The warriors, now without purpose, became wandering ghosts in their own lands. They could not reintegrate into normal society. They were disconnected from the world around them, unable to form meaningful relationships, unable to connect with others who had never known the violence they had endured. And the impact stretched beyond the warriors themselves. Families were broken. Communities were torn apart. There was no place for these soldiers to return to, no home waiting for them. Their society, once built on strength and unity, was left with a generation of men and women who could no longer feel, could no longer love, could no longer care. The Empire had created perfect soldiers, but it had destroyed its own humanity in the process. There was no place for these soldiers to return to, no home waiting for them, no warm embrace, no welcoming arms. They had been made for war, shaped by the Empire into perfect instruments of conquest. But now, when the war was over, they had no place in the world. They were no longer useful. They had been created to fight. But now, there was nothing left for them to fight for. The Empire had crafted perfect soldiers, strong, efficient, unyielding. But in doing so, it had destroyed its own humanity in the process. In their pursuit of power, the Mongols had created an army of individuals who could no longer feel anything. Their hearts were like stone, and their minds were filled only with strategies for destruction, never for creation. They were warriors, but they were also broken people, individuals who had lost everything that made them human. The very thing that had given them power, their ability to fight, had come at the cost of their souls. The warriors, once the heart of the Empire's might, were now its most tragic consequence. They had given everything for the Empire, their lives, their emotions, their humanity. But in the end, they had nothing left. And the Empire, in its endless pursuit of power, had paid the ultimate price. It had created an army of soldiers who would never know peace, who could never return to the world they once knew. And in doing so, it had condemned them to live with the terrible emptiness that came from living only for war. They could not return to the world they once knew. There was no home for them, no place where they could shed the armor of war and find solace. The families they had left behind were now strangers. The communities that had once embraced them were distant and unfamiliar. And the warriors, the very foundation of the Empire's strength, were now hollow, empty shells of the people they had once been. They could never fit back into the lives they had known. They had been molded for war, but now there was no war left to fight. In creating an army of perfect soldiers, the Empire had doomed its warriors to a life of perpetual emptiness. A life where they could never know peace, never truly rest, never find a place to belong. The Empire's hunger for power had consumed them, and now they were left to wander in the aftermath, stripped of their humanity, unable to reclaim the pieces of themselves they had lost in the fires of conquest. The ultimate tragedy was this. In its pursuit of power, the Empire had created an army that could conquer anything, except for the darkness inside themselves. They had lived only for war, only for the next battle, only for the next conquest. But now, there was nothing left. And in that emptiness, they were condemned to live a life without meaning, a life without the very thing that makes us human: connection, love, the ability to feel. In the end, the Empire's victory had come at an unimaginable cost. It had created warriors who would never know peace, never know the warmth of home, never find the comfort of family. And in doing so, it had doomed them to a life of solitude, of endless wandering in a world that no longer had a place for them. They were soldiers, and nothing more. And that, in the end, was the greatest tragedy of all. The warriors returned home, but home was no longer a place. It was a ghost of what they had once known. The fields they had fought for, the villages they had once called home, now seemed like distant memories, fading away with each passing day. When the war was over, the Empire no longer needed them. They were no longer the perfect soldiers, the conquerors. Now, they were just men. Men without purpose, without a reason to exist. The emptiness was suffocating. The silence that followed years of war was louder than any battlefield cry. They had been warriors, created for war. But now that the fighting had stopped, they were left to wander through a world that no longer had a place for them. They had been trained to survive, but survival without war was meaningless. They could no longer fight, no longer kill, no longer conquer. They had been made to destroy, and now, with nothing left to destroy, they were nothing. The emptiness inside them grew like an insatiable hunger, a hunger for battle, for purpose, for meaning. But there was no war left to fight, no enemy to face, no walls to tear down. They had been created to be perfect soldiers, but in doing so, They had been stripped of their humanity. And now, with nothing left to give, they were forced to live with the consequences of that loss. Their minds, once sharp and focused on victory, now wandered, lost in the haze of what had been. Their bodies, once hardened by years of battle, now felt like foreign shells, unfit for the peace they had been left to face. What was left of them? Who were they, if they were no longer warriors? What was the point of their survival, if they could no longer serve the empire they had fought for? They had been created to destroy, to build an empire of power and might, but now, with the empire in its prime, they had no place in it. Their families, they were strangers. The children they had once known, they were now the fathers of their children, but with no understanding of what it meant to be a father. The women they had once loved, they were distant memories. The bonds they had once formed were severed. They were alone, fighting an invisible enemy, the emptiness within. They had lived for war, but now that the war was over, they were left to suffer in silence. And the worst part was this: there was no one left to blame, no one to fight, no enemy to strike down. The enemy was themselves. In the end, the warriors were nothing more than ghosts of the empire they had once built. Their names were forgotten, their battles unremembered, their sacrifice reduced to a mere footnote in history. They had been perfect soldiers, but in the pursuit of perfection, they had lost everything. And with that loss, they paid the ultimate price. The price of creating soldiers without souls. And the empire that had demanded so much, was left to wonder if it was worth it, if all that destruction, all that bloodshed, had been worth the emptiness that followed. As the dust settles on the legacy of the Mongol Empire, we are left with the scars it carved into history, not just in the lands it conquered, nor in the riches or the cities that burned, but in the warriors themselves. Men shaped not only by battle, but by the relentless hammering of an empire's ambition. Their strength was not just in their bodies, but in their minds, in their spirits. They were forged to be perfect soldiers. But at what cost? Their humanity was stripped away, layer by layer, until all that remained was an unfeeling weapon, cold, efficient, ruthless. The empire demanded everything of them, their lives, their hearts, their very souls. They were molded by the empire's will, crafted to be the perfect tools of war. From the moment they were born, they were shaped for one purpose: to fight, to conquer, to destroy. Their emotions were erased, their desires crushed, their dreams buried beneath the weight of survival and victory. But when the war ended and the empire no longer needed them, what remained? What became of the warriors who had been bred for battle, who had given everything to fulfill the empire's ambition? In the silence of peace, they found themselves lost, stripped of the very purpose they had lived for. The story of the Mongol super soldiers is not just one of military brilliance. It is a tale of sacrifice, of the price paid for perfection, and the hollow emptiness that followed. They were the empire's greatest strength, and in the end, its greatest tragedy. Their story endures, etched in the blood-stained pages of history, a reminder of the cost of turning men into weapons. A legacy of warriors who gave everything, only to be left with nothing. Thank you for joining me on this journey through forgotten history. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Because the stories of the past, they're more than echoes. They are threads that bind us, connecting us through time, through memory, through silence. Until next time, rest well and let the echoes of history guide you. Good night, and we will meet again.